Imagine Darth Vader reaches up and removes his helmet. Not because he's dying, not because his life support is failing, but because he chooses to. What you see underneath changes everything you thought you knew about Star Wars. This isn't the Vader, trapped in the mechanical prison. This is a man who wakes up every morning and decides whether to be human or monster. A Dark Lord who could attend Imperial meetings without that iconic breathing. A father who could look his son in the eye from their very first encounter. One simple change, one moment of choice instead of necessity. And suddenly the entire galaxy transforms. The psychological warfare becomes deadlier. The family drama turns more devastating. And the ultimate question of redemption, it gets infinitely more complex. When evil is a conscious daily decision rather than a tragic circumstance. You think you know Vader's story? You don't. Not this version. Picture this. It's the aftermath of the duel on Mustafar, but instead of being left to burn and requiring life support for the rest of his days, Anakin Skywalker receives revolutionary medical treatment. Perhaps the Emperor invested in advanced healing technology, or maybe the Force itself provided a path to recovery that we never saw in our timeline. Whatever the cause, this version of Darth Vader isn't trapped inside his armor. He chooses to wear it. The medical reality of Vader's condition in the original timeline was devastating beyond imagination. The lava flows of Mustafar didn't just burn his body, they fundamentally rewrote his biology. The superheated volcanic gases he inhaled destroyed his lung tissue at a cellular level. The intense heat cauterized blood vessels and nerve endings across 70% of his body. His limbs weren't just severed by Obi-Wan's lightsaber, they were completely destroyed by the subsequent immersion in molten rock. The trauma was so severe that conventional medical treatment would have been completely inadequate. In the original timeline, Palpatine's medical droids worked with primitive cybernetic technology by the standards we might imagine possible in the Star Wars universe. The life support systems were bulky, inefficient, and designed more for function than comfort. The breathing apparatus was necessary because Vader's lungs could no longer process oxygen effectively. His circulatory system required constant monitoring and assistance. His nervous system had been so damaged that the suit needed to interface directly with his remaining nerve pathways to provide sensory input and motor control. But in our alternate scenario, let's imagine that Palpatine had access to medical technology far beyond what we saw in the films. Perhaps he had been secretly developing advanced healing techniques in preparation for his own eventual bodily decline. Maybe he had discovered ancient Sith healing practices that could regenerate tissue at the cellular level. Or possibly he had formed secret alliances with alien species whose medical knowledge far exceeded anything available to the Republic or early Empire. The reconstruction process in our timeline would be revolutionary. Instead of simply replacing damaged organs and limbs with mechanical alternatives, the medical team would focus on regeneration and restoration. Advanced Bacta treatments wouldn't just accelerate healing, they would guide cellular regeneration to restore original function. Synthetic tissue grown from Anakin's own genetic material would be integrated seamlessly with surviving biological systems. The cybernetic limbs wouldn't be crude mechanical replacements, but sophisticated biotechnological hybrids that interface perfectly with his nervous system. Most importantly, the lung damage would be completely reversed. Using a combination of force-enhanced healing techniques and cutting-edge medical technology, new lung tissue would be grown and transplanted. The breathing apparatus that defined Vader's sound and appearance would become completely unnecessary. His respiratory system would function normally, perhaps even better than it had originally. The result? A Darth Vader who could walk the halls of an Imperial Star Destroyer in simple black robes if he chose to. A Dark Lord who could attend strategy meetings without the constant mechanical breathing. a Sith who could remove his helmet and reveal the face beneath whenever the situation demanded it. But most significantly, a man who would face the psychological weight of choosing his identity every single day. This fundamentally changes everything we know about Vader's psychology. In the original timeline, the helmet wasn't just protection or intimidation. It was a prison that served multiple psychological functions. It was a constant reminder of his fall from grace, his dependence on technology for survival, and his transformation from man to machine. The suit was both his salvation and his curse, keeping him alive while simultaneously cutting him off from the world of the living. Every breath was a reminder of his limitations. Every reflection in a mirror showed him the monster he had become. The psychological implications of this constant imprisonment cannot be overstated. Vader's rage and hatred were partially fueled by his physical helplessness, his inability to escape the consequences of his choices, even for a moment. The suit became a psychological anchor to his darkest moments, making it nearly impossible for him to imagine himself as anything other than the mechanical enforcer he appeared to be. But a Vader who could choose when to wear the helmet? That's a completely different psychological profile altogether. The helmet becomes a tool rather than a necessity, a conscious choice to embrace the persona of Darth Vader versus allowing glimpses of the man who was once Anakin Skywalker. This introduces an element of psychological complexity that the original character never possessed. Think about the implications of this choice in minute detail. Every morning, this version of Vader would wake up and decide, helmet or no helmet, machine or man. The psychological weight of that daily decision would be immense. Some days, perhaps the guilt and pain of his past would drive him to hide behind the mechanical facade, using the helmet as a psychological shield against the reality of his actions. Other days, maybe he'd feel strong enough to face the world, as he truly was, scars and all. This creates an entirely different relationship with his identity. Instead of being forced into the role of more machine than man, he actively chooses when to embrace that identity. The internal struggle between Anakin and Vader wouldn't be buried beneath layers of life support equipment and mechanical breathing. It would be a conscious daily battle played out in the simple act of putting on or removing a helmet. The decision-making process itself would become a form of psychological torture and liberation simultaneously. On days when he chose the helmet, he might feel guilty about hiding from his humanity. On days when he appeared without it, he might feel vulnerable and exposed. The constant choice would force him to confront his identity in ways that the original Vader never had to face. Consider the morning routine of this alternate Vader. He wakes in his private chambers aboard his superstar destroyer. The medical bay attached to his quarters contains the regeneration equipment that maintains his restored health, but he doesn't need it to survive. As he prepares for the day, he stands before a mirror that shows him his actual face. The scars from Mustafar are still visible, pale lines across his features that serve as permanent reminders of his fall. His eyes might still carry the yellow tinge of the dark side, or perhaps they flicker between the Sith yellow and his original blue depending on his emotional state. The helmet sits on its stand across the room. Some days, the weight of command and the needs of the Empire would make the choice easy. Imperial officers expect to see the mechanical Dark Lord, and the psychological effect of the helmet on both allies and enemies is undeniable. But other days the helmet might feel like a burden, a costume he's grown tired of wearing. The political ramifications within the Empire would be staggering and far-reaching. Imperial propaganda had carefully crafted Darth Vader into this mythic figure, this implacable force of the Emperor's will. The helmet was central to this mythology. It made him seem inhuman, unstoppable, more force of nature than person. But what happens when your mythic enforcer can reveal himself to be fundamentally human? The Imperial hierarchy would react in complex and contradictory ways. Some officers might lose their fear-based respect if they saw Vader's human face. The mystique that made him so terrifying was partially based on the unknown, the alien quality of his mechanical appearance. Seeing him as recognizably human might make him seem more approachable, more fallible, less godlike in his authority. However, other Imperial officers might develop an even deeper loyalty, seeing him as someone who chooses to be terrifying rather than someone who has no choice in the matter. The psychological impact of a leader who voluntarily becomes a monster is potentially more frightening than one who was forced into it. It suggests a level of commitment to the Imperial cause that goes beyond mere circumstance. Regional governors would react differently based on their own personalities and political positions. Those who had risen through political maneuvering rather than military service might see a helmeted Vader as more legitimate, more in line with Imperial imagery. Others, particularly former Republic military officers who remembered the Clone Wars, might prefer to see the human face, as it would remind them of the hero Anakin Skywalker had once been. The Imperial Navy would have its own complex relationship with this choice. Admiral Piet and other high-ranking officers would need to navigate the uncertainty of never knowing which version of Vader they would encounter. This unpredictability could actually be more effective than consistent intimidation. Predictable fear becomes manageable over time, but unpredictable humanity mixed with the potential for mechanical terror, that keeps everyone off balance, constantly guessing, never quite comfortable. Emperor Palpatine himself would face a unique challenge with this version of his apprentice. In the original timeline, Vader's dependence on his life support made him controllable to some degree. The Emperor held the ultimate power over his apprentice's very breathing, literally controlling his life support systems if necessary. But a Vader who didn't need the suit? That's a Vader who's much harder to control, much more dangerous as a potential rival. The Emperor's relationship with this Vader would be fundamentally different. Palpatine might actually prefer this version in some ways. A healthy Vader would be more powerful in the Force, more capable in combat, more effective as an enforcer of Imperial will across the galaxy. His physical capabilities wouldn't be limited by the bulky life support systems, making him a more formidable opponent against Jedi survivors and rebel forces. But Palpatine would also be more wary of this version. A Vader who wasn't dependent on technology for survival would be much more capable of independent action. The psychological leash that the life support provided would be gone, replaced by the much more tenuous bonds of ideology and shared purpose. This Vader could potentially challenge Palpatine much more effectively, and the Emperor would need to rely more heavily on manipulation and political control rather than physical dependency. The dynamics of their master-apprentice relationship would shift dramatically. Instead of Palpatine maintaining control through Vader's medical dependency, he would need to focus on psychological and political manipulation. This might actually make their relationship more traditionally Sith-like, with the apprentice genuinely capable of overthrowing the master when the time came, rather than being held back by physical limitations. The broader Imperial court would also react in complex ways. Grand Moffs like Tarkin, who had worked with Anakin Skywalker during the Clone Wars, might have conflicted feelings about seeing their colleague's face again. Some might feel nostalgic for the hero he had once been, while others might be disturbed by the transformation they witnessed. The Imperial Guard would face unique challenges as well. Their duty was to protect the Emperor, but their relationship with Vader had always been complicated by his position as both ally and potential threat. A Vader who was physically more capable and less dependent on technology would require different security considerations and protocols. Consider how this would affect Imperial military strategy on a galactic scale. Officers who had to report to Vader would never know which version they were facing on any given day. Are they reporting to the mechanical Dark Lord whose breathing alone could terrify a room into submission? Or are they facing the scarred but human face of a man who chose to become a monster? This uncertainty could actually be more effective than consistent intimidation in maintaining discipline and loyalty. The Rebel Alliance would also react very differently to this version of Vader, and their intelligence networks would struggle to create a coherent profile of their enemy. Intelligence reports describing him would be contradictory and confusing. Some encounters would describe the familiar black-armored enforcer with the mechanical breathing that had become legendary across the galaxy. Others would report a figure in dark robes with a human face bearing the scars of unimaginable trauma. This contradiction would make him harder to understand, harder to predict, and potentially much harder to defeat. The rebellion fought against the Empire partly because it represented the cold, mechanical oppression of freedom and individuality. But how do you maintain that narrative when your enemy's greatest enforcer can literally choose between man and machine? How do you demonize someone who sometimes appears recognizably human? Rebel propaganda would struggle with this complexity. It's much easier to paint a mechanical monster as the enemy of freedom than it is to explain the nuanced evil of someone who chooses to appear monstrous. The simple narrative of good versus evil becomes more complicated when evil has a human face that it willingly shows and hides. The intelligence value of this unpredictability would be enormous for the Empire. Rebel spies would provide conflicting reports, making it difficult for Alliance leadership to develop effective counter-strategies. Some agents might report that Vader was becoming more human, potentially more sympathetic to their cause. Others would report that his ability to appear human made him even more dangerous and manipulative. The most significant changes, however, would be in Vader's personal relationships, particularly with his children. The revelation of Luke Skywalker's existence and their subsequent encounters would unfold in dramatically different ways. Imagine the first confrontation between Luke and Vader in our alternate timeline. Luke extends his lightsaber, ready to face the mechanical monster he's heard described in whispered terror across the galaxy. But instead of the expected black mask, he finds himself facing a scarred, human face. Still intimidating, still radiating dark side power, but undeniably human. The psychological impact of this encounter would be completely different. Luke had prepared himself to face a machine, a force of evil so removed from humanity that it could be fought without reservation. But seeing a human face, even one twisted by the dark side and marked by terrible scars, would introduce doubt and complexity that the original timeline never provided. The revelation of their relationship would hit completely differently as well. Instead of the shocking moment of mechanical breathing stopping as Vader speaks Luke's name, we might have a scene where Vader slowly, deliberately removes his helmet to reveal his identity. The gesture would be loaded with meaning. Here is my true face. Here is who I really am beneath the legend and the fear. The psychological impact on Luke would be immense. It's one thing to learn that the mechanical Dark Lord is your father. There's almost an abstract quality to that revelation. A sense that your father has become something so removed from humanity that the familial connection is more symbolic than real. But it's another thing entirely to see the human face of the man who made that choice, to see the features that might echo your own, to recognize the person beneath the monster. Luke's entire character development might accelerate as a result. Seeing his father's humanity from the beginning, even corrupted and scarred, might make the possibility of redemption seem more real, more achievable. The abstract concept of saving Darth Vader becomes the concrete goal of saving the scarred man whose face he can see. Alternatively, it might make the betrayal feel more personal and devastating. It's easier to forgive a faceless machine than it is to forgive a person who looks you in the eye and chooses evil. Luke might struggle more with anger and hatred, seeing his father's deliberate choices written across his human features. The training sequences with Yoda would take on different meanings as well. Yoda's warnings about anger and hatred would be more immediate and personal. Luke wouldn't be struggling with abstract concepts of good and evil, but with the very concrete reality of his father's human face choosing darkness. The cave vision on Dagobah might show Luke his own face beneath Vader's helmet, but the impact would be different if Vader's helmet was a choice rather than a necessity. Leia's story would change dramatically as well. With the potential for Vader to appear without his helmet, there's a real possibility she might recognize family resemblance much earlier in the timeline. The Force connections between family members are strong, but visual recognition could trigger those connections sooner and more powerfully. Imagine a scenario where Leia, captured aboard a Star Destroyer, is brought before Vader without his helmet. She sees something familiar in his scarred features, some echo of the mother she never knew or the hint of features she shares. The recognition might not be immediate or conscious, but it could plant seeds of doubt and confusion that would affect her interactions with him from that point forward. The political implications of Leia recognizing Vader as her father would be staggering. As a leader of the Rebel Alliance, she would be forced to confront the reality that she was fighting against her own biological father. The personal stakes of the galactic civil war would become impossibly complex. How do you lead a rebellion against an empire when your father is one of its primary enforcers? The psychological trauma would be different as well. In the original timeline, Leia learned about her parentage after Vader's death and redemption, when she could process it as a tragic but resolved piece of family history. But learning it while the conflict was ongoing, while seeing his human face making evil choices, would be devastating in entirely different ways. But perhaps the most emotionally devastating change would be in any potential encounter with Ahsoka. Tano. In the original timeline, Ahsoka's confrontation with Vader and Rebels was heartbreaking, partly because she had to see through the mechanical exterior to recognize her former master. The helmet and breathing apparatus created a barrier that made the recognition gradual and painful. But imagine if Vader had chosen to remove his helmet during their duel. Imagine Ahsoka seeing Anakin's face, scarred and aged and filled with the dark side, but still recognizably the man who had been like a brother to her. The emotional weight of that revelation would be almost unbearable. The recognition would be immediate and devastating. There would be no gradual realization, no piecing together of clues, just the stark reality of seeing her former master's face. Twisted by hatred and dark-side corruption, Ahsoka's reaction would be different too. Instead of the slow, painful acceptance we saw in the original timeline, she might react with immediate anger, betrayal, and grief. The dialogue between them would be more personal, more cutting. Ahsoka could look into his eyes and see the person she once knew, making her accusations and disappointments more direct and painful. Vader, in turn, would be forced to confront his past more directly, unable to hide behind the mechanical facade that had allowed him to compartmentalize his previous identity. Combat scenarios throughout the saga would also change significantly. The practical advantages of being able to remove the helmet are substantial and would affect every lightsaber duel and military engagement. Better peripheral vision would make Vader more aware of his surroundings, able to track multiple opponents. More effectively, improved hearing would allow him to detect subtle audio cues that the helmet's audio systems might miss or distort. More natural breathing during intense physical activity would increase his endurance and stamina. The original Vader's breathing was regulated by his life support systems, which might not have been optimized for the variable demands of lightsaber combat. A Vader who could breathe naturally would be able to sustain intense physical activity for longer periods without the limitations of mechanical respiratory assistance. However, there would be significant trade-offs that would make combat more complex and interesting. The helmet provided substantial protection against both lightsaber strikes and environmental hazards. A helmetless Vader would be more vulnerable to attacks targeting his head and face. Skilled opponents might be able to exploit this vulnerability, forcing him to be more defensive in his fighting style. The intimidation factor would also be reduced in some circumstances. There's something deeply unsettling about fighting an opponent whose face you can't see, whose breathing is mechanical and rhythmic, whose expressions are completely hidden. A human face, even a scarred and intimidating one, is still human. It can show pain, fatigue, emotion, doubt. These tells could potentially be exploited by skilled opponents who knew how to read facial expressions and body language. The psychological warfare aspects would become incredibly complex. Vader might choose to fight some opponents while helmeted, to maintain the mystique and intimidation factor that had served him so well. For others, particularly those with personal connections to his past, he might remove it deliberately to increase their emotional distress. Imagine him removing his helmet mid-duel with a former Jedi who knew Anakin Skywalker. The psychological impact could be more devastating than any lightsaber strike. The Jedi would be forced to confront the reality that their former ally had chosen to become their enemy, that the face they once trusted was now twisted by hatred and dark side corruption. The specific mechanics of lightsaber combat would change as well. Vader's fighting style in the original timeline was partially adapted to the limitations and advantages of his armor. The bulk of his suit required a more deliberate, powerful approach rather than the acrobatic style he had used as Anakin. But a Vader who could remove the helmet at will might develop a more versatile fighting style, switching between armored and unarmored combat depending on the situation. Strategic considerations during major battles would be dramatically different. In the original timeline, Vader's need for his life support systems created vulnerabilities that could theoretically be exploited. Electrical attacks, electromagnetic pulses, or damage to specific system components could potentially disable or kill him. But a Vader who chose to wear the armor rather than needing it would be much harder to disable through technical means. This version of Vader would also be more adaptable to different environmental conditions. The original required specific atmospheric conditions and could be vulnerable to certain types of environmental hazards. Extreme cold, heat, or atmospheric compositions that would overwhelm his life support systems could limit his effectiveness. But a Vader who could remove his helmet and breathe naturally would be much more versatile in different combat environments. Underwater combat, for instance, would be possible with appropriate equipment rather than being completely impossible due to life support limitations. High-altitude environments, toxic atmospheres with proper protection, extreme temperature variations, all of these would become manageable rather than potentially fatal. The broader implications for the Force itself are fascinating to consider and would ripple throughout the entire galactic conflict. In the original timeline, Vader's physical limitations may have actually constrained his Force potential. While pain and suffering can fuel the dark side, physical limitations and dependency can also limit the full expression of Force abilities. Healthier Vader might be capable of Force techniques we never saw in the original timeline. His telekinetic abilities might be stronger without the energy drain of life support systems. His precognition and battle meditation might be clearer without the constant background noise of mechanical breathing and system monitoring. His ability to influence minds might be more subtle and effective without the intimidating but limiting mechanical presence. But there's a deeper philosophical question about the nature of the Force and how it interacts with physical and emotional states. Part of Vader's connection to the dark side was driven by his constant physical pain and his rage at his limitations. A Vader who was healed, who wasn't constantly confronting his own mortality and dependency, might have a fundamentally different relationship with the Force. Would this version of Vader be more or less committed to the Sith path? The answer is complex and would depend heavily on his psychological development. On one hand, he wouldn't have the constant physical reminders of his fall driving him deeper into darkness. The rage and hatred that fueled his dark side powers wouldn't be constantly reinforced by physical pain and limitation. On the other hand, knowing that he chose to become what he was, that he wasn't forced into it by irreversible physical damage, might make him more committed to that choice. There would be a psychological weight to owning his transformation completely without the excuse of medical necessity. The daily choice of wearing or removing the helmet would become a meditation on his identity and commitment to the dark side. Each time he put on the helmet, he would be consciously choosing to embrace the Vader persona. Each time he removed it, he would be confronting the reality of who he had become and why. This constant self-examination might actually make him more dangerous as a Sith. Instead of being driven by unconscious rage and pain, his dark side connection would be more deliberate and focused. He would understand his motivations more clearly, making his actions more calculated and effective. The training of any potential apprentices would also be different. A Vader, who had conscious control over his identity and appearance, could be a more effective teacher. He could demonstrate the choice between light and dark side, literally showing apprentices the difference between the man and the monster. This visual metaphor would be incredibly powerful for Sith training. The redemption arc that we see in Return of the Jedi would unfold in completely different ways, with implications that would redefine the entire emotional core of the Star Wars saga. Luke's entire strategy for saving his father was based on appealing to the humanity buried beneath the mechanical exterior. He believed that Anakin Skywalker still existed somewhere inside the machine, that the good man could be reached, despite the layers of technology and dark side corruption. But what if that humanity was always visible? What if the struggle between Anakin and Vader was written across his scarred features for anyone to see? Luke might be more hopeful about the possibility of redemption, seeing his father's human face and recognizing the man beneath the monster. But he might also be more disappointed and angry when that human face continues to make evil choices. It's psychologically easier to forgive someone who was forced into darkness by circumstance than someone who actively chooses it every day. The original Vader could be seen as a victim of his own poor choices and Palpatine's manipulation, someone who was trapped by forces beyond his control. But this alternate Vader would bear full responsibility for his actions in a way that the original never did. The conversations between Luke and Vader would be more direct and personal. Instead of speaking to a mechanical mask, Luke would be looking into his father's eyes, seeing the emotions and conflicts playing across his features. The helmet had provided a barrier that allowed both characters to maintain some emotional distance. Without it, their interactions would be more raw and immediate. Luke's anger might be more pronounced as well. Seeing his father's human face choosing evil, seeing the deliberate nature of his dark side commitment, might make Luke's own struggles with anger and hatred more intense. The temptation to strike down his father in anger might be stronger because the evil would be more personal and visible. The final confrontation with Emperor Palpatine would be dramatically different and would require a complete reimagining of the climactic scenes of Return of the Jedi. In the original timeline, the moment when Vader removes his helmet for Luke is incredibly powerful, partly because it's the first time we see his humanity fully revealed. The physical act of removing the helmet becomes symbolic of his return to the light side. But in our alternate scenario, that revelation would have happened much earlier in their relationship. The climactic moment would need different symbolism to carry the same emotional weight. Instead, the pivotal moment might be Vader choosing to put the helmet back on one final time, embracing the Vader persona completely to gather the strength needed to destroy his master. Or perhaps the opposite would be more powerful. Him removing the helmet defiantly in front of Palpatine, choosing to face his master as Anakin Skywalker rather than as his Sith apprentice. The symbolic weight of that choice, helmet on or off, would carry the entire emotional climax of the saga. The Emperor's reaction would be different as well. Palpatine had grown accustomed to dealing with the mechanical Vader, someone whose emotions were filtered through life support systems and whose humanity was largely hidden. Facing the raw emotions and visible humanity of his apprentice would require different manipulation techniques. Palpatine might actually be more effective at manipulation if he could see Vader's facial expressions and emotional reactions directly. The ability to read his apprentice's face would provide valuable information for psychological manipulation, but it might also make Vader's eventual rebellion more obvious and harder to prevent. From a broader storytelling perspective, this alternate version of Vader would be incredibly complex and would challenge audiences in ways that the original character never did. He'd be simultaneously more and less sympathetic than the original Vader. More sympathetic because his humanity would always be visible, because audiences could see the man beneath the monster. Less sympathetic because his evil actions would clearly be conscious choices rather than the result of being trapped in a mechanical prison. The visual storytelling opportunities would be remarkable and would revolutionize how the character is portrayed in film. Directors could use the helmet as a visual metaphor throughout the saga. Scenes where Vader chooses to wear it could show his embrace of the dark side or his retreat from emotional vulnerability. Moments where he removes it could hint at internal conflict, the possibility of redemption, or his willingness to confront his true self. The lighting and cinematography around these choices would become crucial storytelling elements. The act of putting on or removing the helmet could be filmed to emphasize different emotions: defiance, shame, anger, hope, despair. The helmet could become a visual representation of his internal state, with audiences learning to read his psychological condition based on his choice to wear it or not. Imagine the marketing and cultural implications as well. The Vader helmet is one of the most iconic designs in cinema history, instantly recognizable around the world. But in this alternate timeline, it would represent something entirely different. Instead of being a prison or a life support necessity, it would represent choice, agency, and the conscious decision to embrace or reject one's humanity. The merchandise, the cultural impact, the way children play with Vader toys, all of it would be fundamentally different if the helmet represented choice rather than necessity. The character would become a more complex symbol in popular culture, representing the daily choices we all make between our better and worse natures. This version of Vader would also age differently throughout the saga, adding another layer of visual storytelling. In the original timeline, the Vader we see in A New Hope is essentially the same as the one in Return of the Jedi. The suit hides any physical changes, and his voice remains mechanically consistent. There's a timeless quality to the original Vader that makes him seem more myth than man. But a Vader who could remove his helmet would show the passage of time. His hair would gray, his scars might fade or change, his face would age and show the toll of his choices. These visual changes would add another layer to his character development, allowing audiences to literally see the cost of his path. We could watch as the man beneath the helmet grows older, perhaps wiser, perhaps more bitter. The years of commanding the Imperial military would leave their mark. The stress of serving Palpatine, the weight of his evil actions, the internal conflict between his identities, all of it would be visible in his changing appearance. The impact on other characters in the Star Wars universe would ripple outward in countless ways. Imperial officers who served under this version of Vader would have completely different relationships with him. Some might see him as more approachable when he appeared without the helmet, leading to different command dynamics and possibly more effective military operations. Others might find the unpredictability more disturbing than the consistent mechanical presence. At least with the original Vader, officers knew what to expect. This version would keep everyone guessing, never quite sure whether they were dealing with the intimidating Dark Lord or the scarred man beneath. Veterans of the Clone Wars who recognized Anakin Skywalker's features would face their own complex emotions. Some might feel sympathy for their former general, while others might feel betrayed by his transformation. The personal history would make every interaction more charged and complicated. Jedi survivors who encountered this version of Vader would face a different kind of trauma. It's one thing to see your former ally transformed into a mechanical monster. That transformation, while tragic, creates a psychological distance that makes the betrayal easier to process. It's another thing entirely to see him as recognizably human while he hunts you down and destroys everything you once stood for together. The survivors might struggle more with hope, seeing flashes of the man they once knew. But they might also struggle more with despair, seeing that humanity consciously choose evil. The complexity would make their encounters with Vader more emotionally devastating and psychologically damaging. The cultural impact within the Star Wars galaxy would be immense and far-reaching. Vader's image would be used differently in Imperial propaganda. Instead of the consistent mechanical enforcer, propaganda artists would need to decide which version of Vader to portray. Do they show the intimidating helmet to maintain fear? Do they show the human face to emphasize his connection to the Imperial cause? Different planets and species would react differently to these varying portrayals. Some cultures might be more intimidated by the mechanical appearance, while others might find the human face more disturbing. The complexity would require more sophisticated propaganda strategies. His legend would grow in different directions across the galaxy. The stories told about him in cantinas and spaceports would vary wildly. Some would describe encounters with the mechanical Dark Lord, while others would tell of meeting the scarred man who chose to become a monster. These conflicting accounts would add to his mystique and make him even more legendary. Children growing up under the Empire would have a different relationship with fear if their greatest boogeyman could sometimes appear human. The psychological impact of Imperial rule would be more complex and nuanced. Fear of the unknown is different from fear of someone who could be your neighbor, who could sit across from you at a cantina table. The economic implications of this alternate timeline would also be significant. The advanced medical technology required to heal Vader would represent a massive investment in research and development. The Empire would need to dedicate enormous resources to developing these capabilities, which could affect other aspects of Imperial infrastructure and military development. The successful healing of Vader might lead to advances in medical technology throughout the Empire. If such techniques could restore someone from Vader's condition, they could revolutionize treatment for countless other medical conditions. This could lead to longer lifespans, better health outcomes, and potentially greater loyalty to the Empire from citizens who benefit from these medical advances. Alternatively, the technology might be kept secret and limited to the highest levels of Imperial leadership. Palpatine might reserve these medical capabilities for himself and his most important servants, creating another layer of dependency and control. The promise of healing and life extension could become a powerful tool for maintaining loyalty among Imperial leaders. The military implications extend far beyond Vader himself. An Imperial military led by a healthier, more capable Vader would be more effective in combat operations. His improved physical capabilities would allow him to take on more challenging missions and lead from the front more effectively. The psychological impact on Imperial troops would be significant as well. Serving under a leader who chose his intimidating appearance rather than being forced into it might inspire different kinds of loyalty. Some troops might see him as more committed to the Imperial cause, while others might find his humanity more relatable and inspiring. Rebel intelligence operations would need to completely restructure their approach to gathering information about Vader. The inconsistency in his appearance would make it difficult to track his movements and predict his actions. Spy networks would need to account for multiple possible appearances and behavioral patterns. The Rebel Alliance would also need to develop different strategies for countering Vader in military operations. The original Vader's limitations were somewhat predictable, but this version would be more adaptable and harder to anticipate. Rebel tacticians would need to prepare for a wider range of possible combat scenarios. The broader galactic civil war would unfold differently, with these changes rippling through every major battle and campaign. Vader's improved capabilities might allow the Empire to crush certain rebellions more quickly, but his increased independence might also lead to strategic disagreements with Palpatine that the rebellion could exploit. The timeline of major events might shift significantly. If Vader is more effective in the early years of the Empire, the rebellion might develop differently or be forced to adopt different strategies. Alternatively, if his independence leads to conflicts with Palpatine, the Empire might be weakened by internal power struggles. The philosophical implications of this alternate timeline extend far beyond the immediate story. We're really exploring fundamental questions about identity, choice, and moral responsibility. The original Vader represented the tragedy of someone who lost himself to circumstances and poor choices, someone who became trapped by the consequences of his actions. This alternate Vader would represent something more complex and morally challenging, someone who chooses every day whether to be a man or a monster. His evil would be more deliberate and conscious, but his potential for redemption would also be more immediate and accessible. The Star Wars saga has always been about the choices we make and how they define us. This version of Vader would take that theme and make it literal. Every day, he would choose his identity. Every scene, he would decide who he wanted to be. And every time he faced his son, he would have to decide whether to meet him as Darth Vader or as Anakin Skywalker. Psychological complexity of this choice would make for incredibly rich storytelling. Audiences would be forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and redemption. Is someone who consciously chooses evil more or less forgivable than someone who is driven to it by circumstance? Can redemption be meaningful if the choice to be evil was always conscious and deliberate? The character would also challenge traditional notions of heroism and villainy. The original Vader fit neatly into the category of tragic villain, someone who fell from grace and became trapped by his choices. But this version would blur those lines, creating a character who is simultaneously more responsible for his actions and more capable of changing them. In examining the long-term consequences of this alternate timeline, we see how a single change, the ability to remove a helmet, cascades through every aspect of the Star Wars universe. The political structures of the Empire would be different, the psychology of its characters would be more complex, and the fundamental themes of the saga would be deeper and more challenging. This version of Vader would force audiences to confront the reality that evil is often not the result of tragic circumstances or external forces, but a conscious choice made by people who could choose otherwise. And conversely, that redemption is always possible as long as the choice remains available. The helmet becomes not just a piece of armor, but a symbol of agency itself. In our alternate Star Wars galaxy, Darth Vader's greatest power wouldn't be his Force abilities or his lightsaber skills. It would be his ability to choose every moment of every day who he wanted to be. That choice, more than any Death Star or Imperial fleet, would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the galaxy far, far away. And in the end, perhaps that's the most profound change of all, transforming Star Wars from a story about destiny and fate into a story about the power of conscious choice and the responsibility that comes with true freedom. The implications ripple forward through generations. If Vader could choose his identity, if the helmet represented agency rather than imprisonment, then every character in the saga would be forced to confront their own choices more directly. Luke would have to decide whether to save a father who consciously chose evil. Leia would have to lead a rebellion against someone who willingly became a monster. And Vader himself would have to face the ultimate question: when given the power to choose who you are every day, who do you decide to become? In our alternate timeline, the answer to that question would echo through the Force itself, shaping the destiny of the galaxy and challenging everyone in it to examine their own choices, their own capacity for good and evil, and their own power to decide who they want to be. But let's dive deeper into the specific moments and encounters that would be fundamentally transformed by this change. Picture the scene aboard the Death Star when Princess Leia is first brought before Vader in A New Hope. In the original timeline, she faces a towering figure in black armor, his breathing mechanical and intimidating, his face hidden behind an impenetrable mask. But in our alternate scenario, Vader might choose to remove his helmet for this interrogation, revealing his scarred human features as he questions her about the stolen Death Star plans. The psychological impact on Leia would be dramatically different. Instead of defying a faceless machine, she would be staring into the eyes of a man who had chosen to become a monster. The personal nature of the confrontation would be heightened, and her famous retort about recognizing his foul stench might take on different meaning when directed at a visible human face rather than a mechanical presence. But even more intriguingly, imagine if during this encounter, some unconscious part of Leia recognized something familiar in Vader's features. The Force connection between father and daughter might be triggered not just by proximity, but by visual recognition of shared family traits. She might find herself disturbed by an inexplicable sense of familiarity, unable to understand why this Imperial Enforcer's face seemed to carry echoes of features she couldn't quite place. The ripple effects of this early encounter would cascade through the entire saga. Leia's subsequent interactions with Luke might carry a subconscious weight she couldn't understand. When Luke begins to develop his Force abilities, her own sensitivity might be heightened by that unresolved sense of recognition. The revelation of their family connection would hit with even greater impact because the groundwork would have been laid through visual recognition rather than just Force sensitivity. Moving forward to the Cloud City confrontation in The Empire Strikes Back, the entire sequence would be reimagined around the theme of choice and identity. When Luke arrives to rescue his friends, he might find Vader waiting for him with his helmet already removed, standing in the carbon-freezing chamber with his scarred face fully visible. The psychological warfare would begin immediately, with Vader using his human appearance to unsettle Luke's expectations. The lightsaber duel itself would take on different dimensions. Luke would be fighting not just against a dark side opponent, but against someone whose humanity was constantly visible. Every expression of pain, anger, or concentration would be written across Vader's features. Luke might find himself hesitating at crucial moments, seeing the human cost of their conflict reflected in his opponent's face. When the moment comes for the revelation of their relationship, instead of the iconic "I am your father" delivered through a mechanical mask, we might see Vader's human face speaking those words directly to his son. The emotion would be more immediate, more personal. Luke wouldn't be hearing this revelation from a machine, but from a man whose features might echo his own, whose eyes might carry traces of the same blue that Luke sees in the mirror. The psychological devastation for Luke would be compounded by the visual recognition. It's one thing to learn that Darth Vader is your father when Vader is a faceless enforcer. It's another entirely to see the human face behind that revelation, to recognize family resemblance even in features twisted by the dark side. Luke's fall from the gantry might be driven not just by the shock of the revelation, but by the visceral impact of seeing his potential future written across his father's scarred face. The carbonite rescue sequence would also play out differently. When the rescue team infiltrates Jabba's palace, they would need to account for the possibility that Vader might appear in either form. The uncertainty would add another layer of tension to an already dangerous mission. Leia, disguised as Boushh, might find herself wondering which version of the Empire's enforcer she might encounter. The space battle above Endor and the confrontation on the second Death Star would represent the culmination of all these accumulated changes. Luke's surrender to Imperial forces would carry different weight if he couldn't be certain whether he would face the mechanical Dark Lord or the scarred man beneath. The shuttle ride to the Death Star might include moments where Vader chooses to remove his helmet, forcing Luke to confront his father's humanity during their final journey together. The throne room scene with Emperor Palpatine would be radically different in its dynamics. Palpatine's manipulation would need to account for the fact that Vader's emotional state would be more visible and therefore more volatile. The Emperor might actually prefer to keep Vader helmeted during these crucial moments, recognizing that the mechanical facade provides better emotional control. But Luke's strategy would be different as well. Instead of trying to reach the man beneath the machine, he would be appealing directly to someone whose humanity had always been visible. His arguments about the light side still existing within his father would be more immediate and personal. He could look into Vader's eyes and speak directly to the man he could see, rather than hoping to reach someone buried beneath layers of technology. The climactic moment when Vader chooses to save Luke would carry different symbolic weight. Instead of the act of removing his helmet representing a return to humanity, the crucial choice might be whether to put it on or take it off in that final moment. Does he save his son as Darth Vader, embracing the power of the dark side one last time? Or does he cast aside the helmet and face Palpatine as Anakin Skywalker, choosing humanity over power? The aftermath would be equally transformed. In the original timeline, Luke finally sees his father's face as Anakin dies, creating a powerful moment of recognition and reconciliation. But in our alternate scenario, Luke would have known that face throughout their relationship. The dying moments between father and son would be more about the words they exchange than the visual revelation, focusing on forgiveness and understanding rather than recognition. The funeral pyre scene would take on different meaning as well. Instead of burning the armor that had imprisoned his father, Luke might be burning the symbol of choice that the helmet had represented. The flames would consume not just the physical remains of Darth Vader, but the daily burden of choosing between identities that had defined his father's existence. But the implications extend far beyond the main narrative. Consider how this change would affect the broader mythology of the Jedi and Sith orders. In the original timeline, Vader's fall was seen as a cautionary tale about the price of turning to the dark side. The mechanical suit served as a visual reminder of what happened to those who chose power over compassion. But a Vader who could choose his appearance would represent something different. The daily struggle between light and dark that exists within everyone. This would fundamentally change how surviving Jedi would view the dark side. Instead of seeing it as a trap that physically transforms and imprisons its victims, they would understand it as a series of conscious choices that someone could theoretically walk away from at any time. This might make some Jedi more hopeful about the possibility of redeeming fallen Jedi, while making others more judgmental about those who continued to choose darkness. The Sith philosophy would also evolve differently. Instead of embracing transformation through destruction, the Order might focus more on the power that comes from conscious choice. The helmet would become a symbol not of what Sith must become, but of what they choose to become. This could lead to different training methods and different interpretations of Sith doctrine. The technological development within the Star Wars universe would also be affected. The medical techniques used to heal Vader would represent a massive advancement in the Empire's capabilities. These technologies might be applied to other aspects of Imperial society, potentially creating a healthier, longer-lived population that would be more grateful to Imperial rule. Alternatively, the techniques might be jealously guarded by the Emperor, creating a new form of social stratification based on access to advanced medical treatment. This could lead to different kinds of rebellion, with groups fighting not just for political freedom, but for medical equality. The economic implications would ripple through every aspect of galactic society. The resources devoted to Vader's healing would need to come from somewhere, potentially affecting other Imperial projects. The Death Star construction might be delayed, or other military programs might be scaled back to fund the medical research. But the successful healing might also lead to new economic opportunities. If the Empire could market these medical advances to wealthy clients throughout the galaxy, it could create new revenue streams that would make the Empire less dependent on taxation and resource extraction from member worlds. The cultural impact would vary dramatically across different species and planets. Some cultures might see Vader's ability to choose his appearance as a sign of strength and self-determination. Others might view it as deception or instability. The Empire would need to tailor its propaganda to account for these different cultural reactions. On worlds where facial scarring is seen as honorable, Vader's willingness to show his scars might actually increase his prestige. On planets where physical perfection is valued, his choice to hide his damage behind a helmet might be seen as weakness or vanity. These varying reactions would create new challenges for Imperial governance. The underground resistance movements would also develop differently. Some rebel cells might focus on the hope that Vader's visible humanity represents, believing that if the Empire's greatest enforcer can retain his humanity, then the Empire itself might be redeemed. Others might be more disturbed by the conscious nature of his evil, leading to more radical and uncompromising resistance movements. The intelligence networks on both sides would need to adapt as well. Imperial intelligence would need to manage the complications of having their most recognizable enforcer appear in multiple forms. Rebel intelligence would struggle to create accurate psychological profiles when their target's behavior could vary so dramatically based on his choice of appearance. The training academies for both Imperial officers and Rebel commanders would need to include scenarios for dealing with either version of Vader. Imperial officers would need to learn how to react appropriately, whether they encountered the helmeted Dark Lord or the Scarred Man. Rebel operatives would need strategies for both versions, recognizing that their tactics might need to change depending on which form Vader chose to take. The effect on civilian populations would be profound as well. Citizens of the Empire would grow up with conflicting images of their greatest symbol of Imperial power. Some would know him only through propaganda showing the mechanical enforcer, while others might catch glimpses of the human face beneath. This inconsistency could lead to different interpretations of what the Empire represents and what it demands of its citizens. Children, in particular, would have a complex relationship with the Vader legend. Some might be more frightened by the human face that chooses evil than by the mechanical monster that seems beyond human understanding. Others might be more hopeful, seeing in his humanity the possibility that even the darkest figures can change. The merchant and smuggling communities would develop their own folklore around these dual identities. Stories would spread through the galaxy about encounters with both versions, with some tales suggesting that the helmeted Vader was more predictable and therefore easier to avoid, while others claimed that the human-faced Vader was more dangerous because he could blend in with ordinary people. The medical community throughout the galaxy would be intensely interested in the techniques used to heal Vader. Some might try to reverse engineer the procedures, leading to black market medical treatments and potentially dangerous experimentation. Others might petition the Empire for access to these technologies for civilian use, creating new political pressures. The implications for Force-sensitive individuals would be particularly complex. Those with latent abilities might find their powers awakened differently depending on which version of Vader they encountered. The mechanical presence might trigger fear-based awakening, while the human face might evoke more complex emotional responses that could lead to different manifestations of Force sensitivity. The underground network of Force sensitives who escaped the Jedi Purge would need to develop new protocols for dealing with either version of Vader. Their strategies for avoiding detection might need to be adjusted based on which form he was likely to take in different situations. The long-term evolutionary impact on galactic society would be immense. This version of Vader would represent a new kind of leader. Someone whose power comes not from being trapped by circumstances, but from the deliberate choice to embrace certain aspects of their nature while rejecting others. This could influence how other political leaders approach their own public personas. The concept of identity itself would become more fluid throughout the galaxy. If even Darth Vader could choose who he appeared to be, it might inspire others to think more consciously about their own identities and the personas they present to the world. This could lead to cultural shifts toward greater self-examination and more deliberate identity construction. The artistic and creative communities would be deeply influenced by this duality. Writers, musicians, and visual artists might explore themes of chosen identity and conscious transformation in their work. The helmet would become a powerful symbol in galactic culture, representing not imprisonment, but the power to choose one's own presentation to the world. The religious and philosophical implications would reverberate through every belief system in the galaxy. The Jedi concept of balance between light and dark would take on new meaning if it was represented by someone who could literally choose which aspects of himself to reveal. Some might see this as the ultimate expression of balance, while others might view it as dangerous instability. New religious movements might emerge around the concept of conscious identity choice. Some might worship the helmet as a symbol of transformation, while others might see the choice to remove it as representing enlightenment or spiritual growth. The impact on military doctrine would extend far beyond the Imperial forces. Rebel tactics would need to account for an opponent who could fundamentally change his psychological impact by simply changing his appearance. Training manuals would need to include strategies for dealing with both the intimidating mechanical presence and the unpredictable human face. The development of new technologies might also be influenced by this change. If identity and presentation could be consciously chosen, other beings might seek technological means to achieve similar flexibility. This could lead to advances in holographic disguises, modular armor systems, or even cybernetic enhancements that could be activated or deactivated at will. In the end, this single change, the ability for Vader to choose whether to wear his helmet, would transform the Star Wars galaxy into a place where the themes of choice, identity, and conscious transformation would be literally embodied in its most iconic character. Every other character would be forced to grapple with what it means to choose who you are, and every audience member would be challenged to examine their own daily choices about identity and presentation. The galaxy far, far away would become a place where the power to choose who you are is the ultimate force, more potent than any Death Star, more transformative than any political revolution, and more hopeful than any prophecy. Because in the end, the choice to be human or monster, to embrace compassion or cruelty, to hide behind masks or reveal our true selves, is the choice that defines not just individuals, but entire civilizations and the destiny of all sentient life in the universe. But let's examine the specific psychological mechanisms that would drive this alternate Vader's daily decisions. Each morning as he stands before his mirror in the private quarters of his superstar destroyer, he would face what psychologists call decision fatigue before his day even begins. The weight of choosing his identity would create a unique form of mental exhaustion that the original Vader never experienced. The original Vader's psychological state was relatively stable in its horror. He knew what he was, what he looked like, how others would react to him. There was a perverse comfort in that certainty, even if it was the certainty of being feared and isolated. But this alternate Vader would live in constant psychological flux, never quite settling into a stable sense of self because that self was always subject to change. Consider the ripple effects of this internal instability on his Force abilities. The dark side draws power from strong emotions like anger, hatred, and fear. but it also requires a certain psychological coherence to channel effectively. A Vader, who was constantly questioning his own identity, might actually be less stable in his dark side powers, experiencing fluctuations in his abilities based on his psychological state on any given day. On days when he chose to embrace the Vader persona completely, donning the helmet and fully committing to the role of mechanical enforcer, his dark side powers might be stronger than they ever were in the original timeline. The conscious choice to be evil, the deliberate embrace of the monster identity, could fuel his hatred more effectively than unconscious suffering ever did. But on days when he appeared without the helmet, when his humanity was visible, his connection to the dark side might be more tenuous. The constant reminder of his human features, the reactions of others to his visible humanity, might create moments of doubt and self-reflection that would weaken his dark side focus. This psychological instability would create entirely new vulnerabilities that his enemies could potentially exploit. Luke, in particular, might learn to read his father's psychological state based on his choice of appearance on any given day. A Luke who understood these patterns could time his appeals for redemption more strategically, approaching his father when his humanity was more visible and his dark side connection was weaker. The Emperor, ever the master manipulator, would certainly recognize these patterns as well. Palpatine might develop sophisticated strategies for managing his apprentice's psychological state, perhaps using specific triggers or situations to encourage Vader to remain helmeted during crucial periods. The master-apprentice relationship would become even more complex, with psychological manipulation replacing the crude control mechanism of life support dependency. The day-to-day interactions with Imperial personnel would be fascinating studies in organizational psychology. Consider Admiral Piet, trying to navigate the complexities of serving under a commander whose entire demeanor could change based on his choice of headgear. Piet would need to develop the ability to quickly assess which version of his superior he was dealing with and adjust his communication style accordingly. When facing the helmeted Vader, Piet might adopt the formal military bearing that we see in the films. But when facing the human-faced Vader, he might find himself unconsciously treating his commander more as a person, perhaps leading to more detailed strategic discussions or even moments of what could almost be called collegiality. This variability would extend throughout the entire Imperial hierarchy. Officers who served directly under Vader would develop almost split personalities of their own, learning to compartmentalize their relationships with their commander based on his chosen appearance. Some might even develop preferences, finding one version of Vader easier to work with than the other. The psychological impact on Vader himself of these varied reactions would be immense. He would be constantly receiving feedback about how his choice of identity affected others. On days when he appeared human, he might notice officers being more relaxed, more talkative, more willing to offer opinions or suggestions. This feedback might actually encourage him to appear without the helmet more often, as he recognized the practical benefits of inspiring less fear in his subordinates. Conversely, on days when immediate compliance and intimidation were necessary, he might choose the helmet specifically for its psychological impact. But this conscious use of fear as a tool might actually make him more effective than the original Vader, because his intimidation would be calculated rather than simply constant. The specific scenarios where he might choose one appearance over the other would become crucial character moments. Meeting with Imperial governors who needed to be intimidated into compliance, helmet on. Conducting strategic planning sessions where creative input was valuable, helmet off. Interrogating prisoners who might respond better to a human face. The choice would become a strategic consideration in itself. But perhaps most interestingly, this Vader might begin to use the choice as a form of communication. Removing his helmet during a meeting might signal his willingness to consider alternative viewpoints. Putting it on might serve as a warning that patience was running thin. The helmet would become a tool for non-verbal communication that added layers of complexity to every interaction. The effect on his personal relationships would be even more profound. In the original timeline, Vader's isolation was largely imposed by his physical condition and appearance. People feared him partly because he seemed so removed from humanity. But this alternate Vader would face a different kind of isolation. The loneliness of someone whose relationships are always contingent on which version of himself he chooses to present. Imagine the psychological toll of never being certain whether someone's reaction to you is based on who you actually are or simply on how you've chosen to appear. This Vader might develop a deep cynicism about relationships, never quite trusting whether people's responses to him are genuine or simply reactions to his chosen persona. This uncertainty might actually drive him deeper into darkness. In some ways, the original Vader's evil was fueled by his physical pain and limitations, but this Vader's evil might be fueled by emotional pain and uncertainty about the authenticity of his relationships. The constant question of whether anyone could truly know or accept him might create a different but equally destructive form of psychological suffering. The interactions with his children would be particularly complex in this regard. When Luke first encounters his father, the psychological dynamic would be completely different from the original timeline. Luke would be looking at a human face, seeing emotions and expressions, trying to read the man behind the legend. But he would also be uncertain about whether what he was seeing was genuine or simply another mask, albeit a biological one. The development of trust between father and son would be more complicated because Luke would never be certain which version of his father he was actually bonding with. Is the man who removes his helmet the real Anakin Skywalker? Or is that just another role being played by someone who has learned to manipulate others through the choice of appearance? Leia's relationship with her father would be even more complex. Her political instincts and leadership experience would make her particularly sensitive to the ways that Vader used his appearance as a tool of manipulation. She might be less likely to trust any apparent humanity he displayed, seeing it as a calculated strategy rather than genuine emotion. But this skepticism might also make her more perceptive about when his humanity was actually genuine. Leia's ability to read people and situations might allow her to distinguish between Vader's calculated use of his human appearance and moments when his true feelings were actually visible. This could lead to a more complex relationship where she becomes almost a lie detector for her father's emotional authenticity. The extended family dynamics would ripple outward as well. Padmé's parents, if they were still alive, might have entirely different reactions to learning about their son-in-law's survival and transformation. Seeing his human face might make his fall feel more personal and painful, but it might also make the possibility of redemption seem more real. The impact on the broader Skywalker legacy would be immense. In the original timeline, the family story is about the tragedy of a good man who fell and was redeemed. But in this alternate timeline, it would be about the complexity of someone who chooses every day who he wants to be. The legacy passed down to future generations would be about the power and responsibility of conscious choice, rather than simply about overcoming adversity. The implications for the Jedi philosophy would be revolutionary. The traditional Jedi teaching about attachment and emotional control would need to be completely reconsidered in light of someone who demonstrated that identity itself could be a conscious choice. This Vader would represent a new model of how someone could engage with both light and dark aspects of themselves while maintaining agency over their ultimate direction. Some Jedi might see this as the ultimate expression of balance, the ability to consciously choose which aspects of oneself to express while maintaining awareness of all aspects. Others might view it as dangerous instability that could lead to unpredictable swings between light and dark. The training of future Jedi would need to incorporate lessons about the conscious construction of identity. Young Jedi would need to learn not just how to resist the temptation of the dark side, but how to consciously choose their identity and presentation while remaining true to their core values. The Sith philosophy would evolve in equally dramatic ways. Instead of embracing transformation through suffering, Sith training might focus on the power that comes from conscious identity manipulation. The ability to choose who you appear to be could become a central Sith skill, with apprentices learning to use their appearance and presentation as weapons in psychological warfare. This could lead to an entirely different kind of Sith order, one based more on psychological manipulation and conscious choice than on raw power and intimidation. The Sith might become more sophisticated in their evil, using the appearance of humanity to gain trust. The technological implications would ripple through every aspect of galactic civilization. The medical techniques used to heal Vader would represent a quantum leap in regenerative medicine. If such healing were possible, it would fundamentally change how beings throughout the galaxy thought about injury, aging, and physical limitation. The cosmetic possibilities alone would be revolutionary. If tissue could be regenerated and scars could be healed or retained by choice, the entire concept of physical beauty and body modification would be transformed. Some might choose to retain scars as marks of honor or experience, while others might seek perfect physical restoration. The psychological counseling profession would need to develop entirely new frameworks for helping individuals who could consciously choose their appearance. Traditional therapy assumes a relatively stable physical identity, but therapists would need to learn how to help clients who could literally change their face, navigate the complexities of chosen identity. The legal implications would be equally complex. How do you establish identity for legal purposes when someone's appearance can be consciously altered? New forms of identification would need to be developed, possibly based on force signatures or other non-physical markers. Criminal justice systems would need to adapt to the possibility that criminals might change their appearance through medical procedures. New laws might be needed to govern the use of regenerative medicine, particularly in cases where individuals sought to hide their identity or escape the consequences of their actions. The economic systems of the galaxy would be fundamentally altered by the availability of advanced regenerative medicine. If physical limitations could be overcome through medical intervention, the entire concept of disability and accommodation would be transformed. Labor markets would need to adapt to a workforce that could potentially overcome any physical limitation. Insurance systems would face unprecedented challenges. How do you calculate risk when physical injury might be completely reversible? How do you price policies when the very concept of permanent physical damage has been eliminated? The entertainment industry would be revolutionized as well. If actors could alter their appearance at will, the entire concept of casting and character portrayal would be transformed. New forms of performance art might emerge around the conscious manipulation of identity and appearance. The fashion industry would face similar upheavals. If physical appearance could be altered medically, the focus might shift from clothing and accessories to more fundamental questions of identity presentation. Fashion might become more about choosing which version of yourself to present rather than simply how to adorn a fixed physical form. The educational systems throughout the galaxy would need to incorporate new curricula around identity choice and management. Students would need to learn not just traditional subjects, but how to navigate the psychological and social complexities of chosen identity. Philosophy and ethics classes would become more important as beings grappled with fundamental questions about the nature of self and authenticity. Literature would evolve to explore themes of chosen identity and the relationship between appearance and reality. The military implications would extend far beyond the immediate tactical considerations. If soldiers could alter their appearance or heal from injuries that would previously have been career-ending, the entire concept of military service would be transformed. Special forces operations might rely more heavily on appearance modification, with operatives able to alter their features for specific missions. The line between espionage and military action might blur as soldiers gain the ability to blend seamlessly into civilian populations. The psychological warfare possibilities would be endless. Military strategists might use appearance modification to create confusion among enemy forces, with the same individual appearing as different people in different contexts. The diplomatic implications would be equally far-reaching. If ambassadors and negotiators could alter their appearance to better connect with different species or cultures, the entire practice of interspecies diplomacy might be revolutionized. But these capabilities might also create new forms of diplomatic crisis. How do you trust a negotiator whose appearance might be consciously chosen to manipulate your responses? New protocols would need to be developed to ensure authenticity in diplomatic interactions. The intelligence-gathering implications would be staggering. Spies who could alter their appearance at will would be nearly impossible to track or identify. Counterintelligence operations would need to develop entirely new methods for detecting and countering such capabilities. The very concept of witness testimony would be called into question. If individuals could alter their appearance, how could eyewitness accounts be trusted? Legal systems would need to develop new standards for evidence and identification. The social networking and communication systems of the galaxy would face unprecedented challenges. If individuals could present different appearances in different contexts, the entire concept of consistent identity across platforms would be undermined. New social protocols would need to emerge around the ethics of appearance choice. Would it be considered deceptive to present different appearances in different social contexts? Would there be expectations of consistency, or would fluidity become the new norm? The family structures and child-rearing practices would be fundamentally altered as well. How do you raise children when their understanding of identity and appearance is so fluid? New parenting strategies would need to emerge around helping children develop healthy relationships with their own identity and presentation. The coming-of-age rituals and traditions would need to be completely reconsidered. Instead of marking the transition from childhood to adulthood, such ceremonies might focus on the moment when young beings gain the ability or right to consciously choose their identity and appearance. The historical record-keeping and documentation practices would face massive challenges. How do you maintain accurate historical records when key figures might appear completely different in different contexts? New methods of documentation would need to be developed that could account for identity fluidity. The artistic and creative communities would experience a renaissance of possibility. Visual artists might explore themes of identity and transformation in entirely new ways. Musicians might compose works that captured the emotional complexity of chosen identity. Writers would have new narrative possibilities around characters, whose appearance could change at will. But these same communities might also struggle with questions of authenticity and artistic truth. If anyone could appear as anyone else, what would that mean for portrait painting or biographical writing? New artistic movements might emerge around these questions of identity and representation. The sporting and competitive communities would need to completely reconsider their rules and standards. If physical limitations could be overcome through medical intervention, how would fair competition be maintained? New categories and classifications might be needed to account for varying levels of medical enhancement. The dating and relationship dynamics throughout the galaxy would be transformed beyond recognition. How do you form romantic attachments when your partner's appearance might be consciously chosen rather than naturally determined? New social norms would need to emerge around disclosure and authenticity in relationships. The very concept of physical attraction would need to be reconsidered. If appearance could be altered at will, would attraction be based on someone's current presentation or their underlying genetic features? New forms of compatibility assessment might emerge that looked beyond surface appearance to deeper markers of identity. The aging process and lifespan considerations would be completely altered. If physical appearance could be maintained or altered at will, the entire concept of aging gracefully would be transformed. Some might choose to maintain a youthful appearance indefinitely, while others might embrace the visual markers of age and experience. The intergenerational relationships would face new complexities. How do you maintain family relationships when multiple generations might appear to be the same age? New social structures might emerge around non-visual markers of generational identity. The memorial and remembrance practices would need to be reconsidered as well. How do you memorialize someone whose appearance changed throughout their lifetime? Which version of their appearance becomes the canonical representation for historical purposes? The immigration and citizenship processes would face unprecedented challenges. If individuals could alter their appearance, how would planetary governments track movement and residency? New forms of identification and documentation would be essential. The insurance and risk assessment industries would need complete overhauls. If physical risks could be mitigated through advanced medical intervention, entire categories of insurance might become obsolete, while new ones would emerge around identity and appearance-related risks. In the final analysis, this single change to Vader's story would transform not just the Star Wars narrative, but the entire conceptual framework of identity, choice, and authenticity that underlies civilized society. The galaxy would become a place where the most fundamental questions of existence, who we are and how we choose to present ourselves, would be literally embodied in its most iconic character. Every being in the galaxy would be forced to confront their own assumptions about identity and appearance. Every institution would need to adapt to a reality where the most basic markers of individual identity could be consciously chosen rather than simply accepted. And in the center of it all would be Vader, no longer just a fallen hero or redeemed villain, but a living symbol of the power and responsibility that comes with the ability to choose who you are every day for the rest of your life. His story would become the galaxy's story, a meditation on choice, identity, and the eternal question of who we decide to become when given the power to be anything we want to be.